All of my plans, all of my pride, the work of my hands, the shame I can't hide, it falls before your throne.
Well, thank you for joining us again. Today we're going to ask the question, what does it mean? Have you ever asked that question when faced with something different or challenging? Something perhaps you'd not come across before? What does it mean? I was thinking back to the pandemic, that moment when life suddenly changed. We went from hearing about the disease spreading in other parts of the world, not imagining it would affect us in the West, to then suddenly the Prime Minister announcing lockdowns and rules about socialising. And I remember asking that question, what does this mean? How are things going to work out? How will my loved ones be affected? How can I keep my loved ones safe? How will church life work out? How does ordinary life work out? What does it mean? Was in fact a question that I'm sure most of us asked at many different times during those lockdown years. But of course there are other times in life when we might ask that same kind of question, when something's changed in our lives. What does it mean? Perhaps when we get a diagnosis of a disease, or the loss of a job, a breakdown of a relationship. But also with positive things too, when we get a new job or promotion, or the start of a new relationship, or maybe even a surprise inheritance. What does it mean? What will life now look like? Well, that question is asked in our passage of Acts today. We're continuing to work through these early chapters of the book of Acts. Let's read what happens. We're going to read Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through to 13. Acts 2, 1 to 13. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly, a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now they were staying in Jerusalem, God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. And when they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment, because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all those who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt and parts of Libya and Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans, Arabs, we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues." Amazed and perplexed, they asked each other, "What does this mean?" Some, however, made fun of them and said, "They've had too much wine." Then Peter stood up with the 11 and raised his voice and addressed the crowd. "Fellow Jews, all of you who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say. These people are not drunk, as you suppose. It's only 9 a.m. No, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. I will show wonders in the heavens above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness, the moon to blood, before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Well, what amazing scene is going on in Jerusalem. The arrival of the Spirit literally seemed to blow the apostles out of their house, out of the safety of their locked room, out onto the streets of Jerusalem. Pretty early in the morning as well, 9 a.m. according to Peter. They were making such a fuss, such a noise that they drew a crowd. The disciples were there praising God in their different languages and dialects as the Spirit enabled them to do so. And of course, these men weren't language scholars. In fact, they were a bit mocked here in this story, known as Galileans who were pretty uneducated. So what was going on? What does this mean? It's a really good question to ask. And that's what the crowd asked in that moment. What does this mean? Were they drunk? Or was something more remarkable happening? Well, of course, we know that Jesus had spent time with the followers in the time between resurrection and ascension. He spent time teaching and helping the disciples to know what was going on, to understand what was going on in the context of all that had been written and all that was now happening through Jesus. And so this is what Jesus had promised. This is what the prophets like Joel had prophesied. The time had come when the floodgates of heaven would be opened and the Spirit of God would be poured on people everywhere, young, old, men, women, educated, non-educated. Finally, this long promised day had arrived, and this meant that nothing would be the same again. What does this mean? Well, this was the birth of the church. Jesus' movement that would spread from Jerusalem and eventually spread into all the known world. This was the movement that would shake empires and change lives. So a good question for us to ask, what does it mean to us? Is this just a story from the Bible, an ancient event that we hear about? Or has the arrival of God's Spirit sent through Jesus inspired us and filled us and made a change in our lives today? And is it time for us to be filled to overflowing again, to recapture the passion of those early followers, to burst out of our homes and our churches with the good news of Jesus for a world that needs to hear and should be asking that question, what is going on? May God bless us as we think about these things. Amen.
I'm handing over my life. You are worth everything. I'm handing